to the 13th episode of the She Said What podcast, where we have unfiltered conversations about the modern landscape as women.
We're your new co-hosts, and I'm Syna, and I'm 17 years old.
Hi, I'm Trisha. I'm 17 years old as well. And today's episode is in honor of the 2021 Olympics in Tokyo, Japan, where athletes are bravely competing after 5 years of hectic training and 1 year in a global pandemic.
We will be discussing a range of topics from the inclusion of transgender people to doping and the story behind Sha'carri Richardson. And finally, the effect of the strenuous training and national representation on the mental health of athletes.
Here's the progress that has been made regarding the inclusion of transgender people in sports by the Olympics. In 2003, the Medical Commission of the International Olympic Committee issued new criteria for athletes who have undergone gender reassignment. Participation was subject to 3 conditions. Athletes must have had sex reassignment surgery, which includes external genital modification and gonadectomy. Second, athletes must demonstrate that their gender is legally recognized. Third, athletes must have been on hormone therapy for a sufficient period of time before competing, with 2 years being the recommended time frame.
However, it is important to understand that in several countries, sex reassignment surgeries are illegal, and in several conservative countries, transgender people are mistreated and not allowed to get the proper medication that they require. It is also difficult to get their name changed legally, so expecting a transgender athlete from India to have all these documents ready is simply not possible.
The IOC committee eventually implemented reforms in 2015 that made it simpler for the transgender society. The revised rules simply require trans women athletes to declare their gender and not change it for 4 years, as well as to have a testosterone level of less than 10 nanomoles per liter for at least a year prior to competing and for the duration of their eligibility. Athletes who converted from female to male were not restricted from competing. Although no openly transgender athletes competed, these criteria were in effect for the 2016 Rio Olympics.
The World Athletics Association has rigid guidelines which have been considered dehumanizing and transphobic due to its nature of pushing trans women into proving their identity. Here are some of the rules. First, she must provide a written and signed declaration that her gender identity is female, in a form satisfactory to the medical manager. Second, she must demonstrate to the satisfaction of the expert panel that the concentration of testosterone has been less than 5 nanomole per liter, continuously for a period of at least 12 months, and thirdly, she must keep her serum testosterone concentration below 5 nanomole per liter for as so long as she wishes to maintain her eligibility to compete in the female category of the competition. Many parallels can be drawn from these guidelines and those of IOC committee in 2016.
Though it seems fair and justified, all women have different bodies, whether cisgender or transgender. Namibian sprinters Christine Momba and Beatrice Masalingi were ruled ineligible to compete in the women's 400 meters at the Tokyo Olympics due to naturally high testosterone levels. Both Momba and Masalingi turned in 4 of the top 5 400-meter times in the world this year. But their elevated testosterone levels above 5 nanomole per liter left the two 18-year-old athletes ruled ineligible on the policy of difference of sex development. It's not the first time female runners have faced this problem. In 2018, Caster Semenya was banned from competing after World Athletics ruled that to ensure fair competition, women with naturally high testosterone levels must take medication to reduce them to compete in middle distance races.
This in itself is controversial and hypocritical as there are strict rules in place regarding medical alteration of the body, which is something we will get into after our discussion. Also, something I wanted to add was that when when transgender women are being questioned about their identity, about their gender identity, it really demotivates them because they're
Mhm.
constantly, it's almost like the organizations are doubting them, that they're judging them at every step. Even while they're registering, they're judging them at every step whether they're whether they fit into the category of women. And that can be
Yeah.
so toxic. And of course, in a field like sports where so much of your performance depends on how you feel and your self-confidence, self-esteem, that can be very demoralizing. Another thing
Mhm.
that's interesting is that transgender women are subjected to these guidelines, and whereas transgender men aren't. And this just shows how, because transgender men would have more estrogen, so essentially they're at a disadvantage than transgender women, right? This just shows that the organization's only concentrating on making it fair for cis players rather than focusing on how these rules affect the transgender community.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. It's like they're trying to push trans people. How do we make them as cisgender as possible? Um,
Exactly. How do
how
we
do
make them
we
uncomfortable?
change them?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think when we divide sports, right, it's men and women. And these divisions are birthed for cisgender people.
Mm-hmm.
They were not created for transgender people to compete because we assumed that all women have female bodies, all women
Yeah.
um, menstruate, all women have high estrogen levels, low testosterone levels. And so those kinds of biological assumptions are being challenged now with the inclusion of transgender people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not new. It's not new for transgender people to compete with cisgender people, but I think it still needs to find its place in the way that we view sports. Um, and like I mentioned, the reason for sports division was that the biology of men being strictly in the sex sense,
Mm-hmm.
they have the ability to build strength more easily and more efficiently than women in terms of the biological sex.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Personally, for me, I'm a big fan of weightlifting, for which India has won a medal, so I'm really happy about that. But I would support a weightlifting style division for individual sports. I guess just like how weightlifting has weight categories and general categories.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, like I'm a swimmer, we have age categories as well. I would like to see how dividing into levels of testosterone would play out specifically for the women's category. I mean, of course, putting someone in a category based on their hormone levels in front of the world is highly invasive. But for now, I don't personally see any other logical option to combat the claims that are made about trans women being at a physical advantage compared to cis women. I say that we have a long way to go in terms of fully and fairly incorporating people with different bodies. Just like Syna had mentioned, medical alteration for cis women with naturally high testosterone levels is controversial and hypocritical. And this leads us to our next discussion, which is about doping. Doping is essentially when athletes use substances such as steroids or other techniques such as blood doping to illegally improve athletic performance.
The World Anti-Doping Agency has created a list of drugs which are considered legal and they are banned from the Olympics. Each athlete has to go through frequent tests leading up to the game and also after the game to ensure that they don't have these drugs in their system. The most severe step taken by the World Anti-Doping Agency was against the Russian team, when the Russian athletes, the entire team essentially, was banned from participating for 4 years, although it was later reduced to 2 years.
Although the WADA has strict guidelines, there are ways in which the Russians were inevitably able to escape the scrutiny. First, no international committee can interfere in another country's laboratory's findings. This prevented the agency officials to verify the reports with a fine tooth comb.
Secondly, when it comes to drugs, there's a lot of gray area. Uh, for instance, some labs have the technology to make drugs that can escape the official testing system. For instance, Maria Sharapova tested positive for meladonium, which is a limited market pharmaceutical drug only produced in Eastern Europe. When we're talking, when a country chooses to use its technology to develop a drug that can easily escape the system, is unethical on so many levels, and also highlights that it's also unfair to the Russian athletes who didn't medically alter themselves, and the fact that the entire team was banned um, shows just how much countries can the shows how the extent to which countries can go to show their prowess to other countries.
I totally agree. And I'd also say the guidelines were quite strict. I think this was highlighted when Sha'carri Richardson was banned for a 30-day period because she smoked cannabis, which has THC, which is a substance banned by the WADA.
Mhm.
Um, I think her backstory behind this is faster. Woody Harrelson would be Usain Bolt. There is no reason for marijuana to be on a banned substance list. Drug testing in sports is complicated, but the principle behind it is pretty simple. It should be designed to keep athletes from using performance enhancing drugs. That's it. Marijuana is not performance enhancing. Other athletes say marijuana can help with mental focus and soothe competition anxiety, as was probably the case with Richardson. On the other hand, writer Gordy Macross ran his own investigation for Outside Magazine back in 2015, using himself as a guinea pig to test the effect of cannabis in a variety of workouts. On skis, he wrote that he felt invincible and proceeded to attack the steepest lines without fear. On the mountain bike, he reports feeling flowy and fast, but then misjudged a turn and rode straight off the trail. Either way, I think as somebody who's never smoked marijuana, I can't tell you whether I feel super worked up or if I feel physically slower in terms of my activity.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the fact that marijuana is legal in 18 United States, I think that definitely says something that maybe marijuana is not as bad, not as controversial in the biological sense as was the convention and as was the stigma that was built around marijuana. I think just like Richardson, all athletes face a buildup of pressure till the final competition. They're not only representing themselves or their families, they are representing their countries. In the Olympics, almost 4 to 5 years of training and hard work have gone into that one performance that will make or break their career.
Yeah, and what's worse is after the competition, the athletes are subjected to interviews with shrewd journalists who make such crude comments and which leave the athletes feeling vulnerable and attacked. This is very common in the game of tennis, right?
Yes, that's true. I mean, usually the loser of the game has to sit in front of the press who are waiting to dissect their game into pieces. That can be extremely demotivating for athletes, and it is mandatory to do so, or else they'll be fined.
Exactly. Just a couple of months back, Naomi Osaka had to resign from the French Open after clashing with officials over her desire to skip media interviews and prioritize her mental health. When people look at athletes, they almost forget that they are humans. They look at them like they're superhumans. We simply look at their physical prowess and forget that they also have their mental health to take care about, especially a minority like Osaka, who is competing in a white-dominated sport.
I really look up to Naomi Osaka. I mean, I don't think we should put athletes on a high pedestal because I guess when you put a person on such a high pedestal, that entire country's eyes, that entire country's hope is on that one person who has one chance to win for themselves and win for their country.
Mhm.
And I think that's a lot of pressure. And I think we need to cut them some slack because, in a way, when we're all contributing to the economy, we're all representing our country in some way or the other, I guess. Athletes, I think they only have one chance, and that is a lot of pressure. I mean, I remember watching the Olympics back in 2012 and seeing a stadium full of people watching these five athletes run for their lives. And I think we need to cut them some slack. Um, Recently, there was the match between England and Italy where England lost. And unfortunately, a lot of the fault went on the three men of color. And it resulted in a lot of racism, it resulted in a lot of domestic abuse. And I think this just highlights the glorification of sports and the passion that sports has, that sports builds up in all of us. But it also means that no matter how passionate we are, the actual sportsmen face 10 times the amount of that pressure. And I wish we could live in a world where we didn't fight over sports and where sports didn't have so many guidelines, where people could just compete because it's something that made them feel free. So, Syna, have you ever done any competitive sports?
I really enjoyed watching the Olympics with my parents and my family sitting in the lobby and watching all these amazing players just, to show their best to the world and bring glory to their country. And that the feeling of watching a person so talented is so satisfying, and it makes me really happy.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I did competitive swimming for years, and honestly, just being in the pool, and even if I come first, even if I come last, it's just such an exhilarating feeling to be there, to be in that moment, and to try my best and to show the result of years of hard work. So I think that's the art of sports in general. I think it's really beautiful. Um, and I wish we could go outside and play more sports, but unfortunately, we both are stuck at home, and we're in 12th grade, and life is in shambles. But that's something we'll discuss for another time. Thank you all so much for listening to our 13th episode of the She Said What podcast. Be in touch. Follow us on Spotify, on Instagram, where we will be updating you on future episodes.